I knew moving into an HOA neighborhood was a risk, but I figured as long as I minded my business, they'd mind theirs. Turns out, that was wishful thinking. It all started when I got a letter in the mail. Dear homeowner, in accordance with new community guidelines, commercial vehicles are now prohibited from being parked in driveways overnight. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $100 per day. I read it twice, thinking I had to be missing something. They were banning my truck? My perfectly legal, fully registered, well-maintained work truck? I run a small construction business, which means my truck, a Ford F-250 with a toolbox and a ladder rack, isn't just for show. It's my livelihood. And now, because some HOA board members thought it ruined the neighborhood aesthetics, they wanted me to hide it away like it was some kind of eyesore. There was just one problem. The letter said trucks couldn't be in driveways overnight. It didn't say a damn thing about where else I could park it. I had a feeling this was going to turn into a fight. Before doing anything drastic, I decided to take the reasonable route. I knocked on the door of Carol Mathers, our HOA president. If the HOA had a queen, she was it, self-important, petty, and obsessed with rules. She opened the door, already looking smug, like she knew why I was there. Mr. Walker, she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. What can I do for you? I got this letter, I said, holding it up. This new rule about commercial vehicles. Where exactly am I supposed to park my truck? She tilted her head. Well, the regulation states that overnight parking in driveways is no longer allowed. It must be kept in a garage or an off-site storage facility. I almost laughed. A garage? Carol, my truck barely fits on my driveway. There's no way in hell it's squeezing into my garage. She gave a tight-lipped smile. Then I suppose you'll need to find alternative arrangements. You mean I'll need to pay to park my own truck somewhere else? Rules are rules, Mr. Walker. I clenched my jaw. And if I don't move it, you'll be fined. She folded her arms. And if fines go unpaid, further actions will be taken. I knew exactly what she meant, towing. I took a deep breath. All right, Carol. Thanks for the clarification. She smiled like she'd won. She had no idea I was about to make her life a nightmare. That night, I sat down with my laptop and pulled up the HOA's bylaws. If they were going to play dirty, I was going to play smarter. It didn't take long to find a loophole. The rule only banned trucks from being parked in driveways overnight. It said nothing about parking on public streets. And wouldn't you know it, right in front of the HOA office, there was a public parking area. A row of perfectly legal spaces maintained by the city. I smiled. Oh, this is going to be fun. That night, instead of parking in my driveway, I took my truck down to the HOA office and backed it into a prime spot, right in front of Carol's window. Then I locked it up and walked home. The next morning, I strolled by just to see her reaction. Sure enough, through the glass office window, I saw Carol standing at her desk, staring at my truck like it had personally insulted her ancestors. I waved. She didn't wave back. That night, I did it again. And the next night. And the next. Every single morning, Carol had to come to work and see my truck, the very thing she was trying to get rid of, right in her face. And there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. But I knew it wouldn't be long before she tried. For the next few nights, I made sure my truck was parked right in front of the HOA office. Every morning, I walked by just to enjoy the sight of Carol seething behind the glass. By day 3, I could feel the tension in the air. The HOA board members weren't used to being challenged, and they really weren't used to being outsmarted. But they weren't about to back down. On the 4th morning, I found a bright orange parking violation notice slapped onto my windshield. Attention, unauthorized vehicle. This vehicle has been reported for violating HOA regulations. Failure to remove it will result in further action. I chuckled. Nice try, Carol. It was a public street. They had zero authority here. I took a picture of the notice, crumpled it up, and tossed it in the truck bed. But that wasn't all. As I walked around the truck, I noticed something else. Someone had tried to key my door. I ran my fingers over the faint scratches. It wasn't deep, just enough to be annoying. My guess? Carol had either done it herself or sent one of her minions. All right, if that's how they wanted to play, I was more than happy to escalate. That evening, instead of just parking the truck, I decided to make a little spectacle out of it. I pulled up extra slowly, making sure the loud rumble of my diesel engine echoed through the street. A few neighbors peeked through their blinds as I reversed perfectly into my usual spot. Then, just for fun, I set up a cheap dash cam on my dashboard, pointing directly at the HOA office. Let's see if they had the guts to key my truck again with the camera watching. Sure enough, the next morning, Carol was waiting for me. She stood by my truck, arms crossed, her face twisted in frustration. "Mr. Walker," she snapped. "This is getting ridiculous." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "What is this?" She threw her hands toward my truck like it was some kind of crime scene. "This is completely inappropriate. You know this isn't what we meant by the parking regulation." "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone, "I think it's exactly what your rule says. It bans overnight parking in driveways. This is a public street." Her eye twitched. "That's not the spirit of the rule." I smirked. "Carol, you can't enforce spirit. You can only enforce what's written." She opened her mouth, then shut it. She knew I was right. But she wasn't done yet. That night, I parked my truck as usual. But this time, I had a bad feeling. Something told me the HOA was going to take things a step further. So I did two things. Firstly, I left my dash cam running all night. Secondly, I called a friend at the local police department, just in case. And sure enough, at 2:30 a.m., I got an alert on my phone. The motion sensor on my dash cam had been triggered. I opened the live feed, and there it was. A tow truck. And standing next to it, Carol. I couldn't believe it. She was actually trying to have my truck towed from a public street, which was 100% illegal. I grabbed my keys and jogged over. By the time I got there, the tow truck driver had already hooked up my front wheels. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," I called out. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Carol spun around, caught off guard. "Mr. Walker, this vehicle is being removed for violating community regulations." The tow truck driver, who clearly wasn't thrilled about being dragged into this, just shrugged. "She told me it was HOA property." I laughed. "Yeah? Well, it isn't. This is a public street. And if you touch my truck again, you're looking at vehicle theft." The driver hesitated, then looked at Carol. "Ma'am, is this actually HOA property?" Carol's face turned red. "It's our community, and yeah, no." The driver unhooked my truck. "I'm not getting arrested for this." Carol looked like she wanted to explode. And just to make things worse for her, red and blue flashing lights lit up the street. My cop friend had arrived. This was about to get really interesting. The second the cop car pulled up, Carol's expression shifted from smug to nervous. She clearly hadn't expected to get caught. Officer Reynolds, my buddy from the local police department, stepped out of his cruiser. He took one look at my truck, nearby to the tow truck, and then at Carol, who was still clutching her clipboard like it was a shield. "Evening, folks," he said. "What's going on here?" Before I could speak, Carol jumped in. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. This vehicle is in violation of HOA regulations, and we're removing it." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Uh-huh. And where's your authority to tow vehicles off a public street?" Carol blinked. "This is our community, and we have rules." Yeah. Reynolds held up a hand, already looking annoyed. "I don't care about your HOA rules. What I care about is the law. And unless this vehicle is stolen or blocking emergency access, you cannot tow it." Carol's lips pressed together. "It's a nuisance." Reynolds sighed and turned to the tow truck driver. "You got paperwork for this tow?" The driver shook his head. "She called me, said it was an HOA issue. Didn't tell me it was on a public street." Reynolds nodded. "All right, here's the deal. If you tow this truck, it's vehicle theft. You want to be on the hook for that." The tow truck driver waved his hands. "Nope. I'm out." He climbed back into his cab and drove off without another word. I crossed my arms and grinned. "Well, Carol, looks like your little stunt didn't work out." Reynolds wasn't done. He pulled out his notepad. "Ma'am, you do realize that attempting to tow a vehicle off a public street under false pretenses is illegal, right?" Carol's face went pale. I didn't know." "Doesn't matter." Reynolds wrote something down and handed her a citation. "That's a $500 fine for attempted unlawful towing. Next time, you'll be looking at criminal charges." Carol snatched the ticket like it physically hurt her to touch it. "This is outrageous." "No," Reynolds said, giving her a hard look. What's outrageous is you thinking the HOA is above the law. I suggest you drop this truck nonsense before you end up in real trouble. Carol didn't respond. She just turned and marched off toward her house. I let out a slow whistle. Damn, Reynolds. That was beautiful. He smirked. You know, I'd tell you to stop messing with her, but I kinda want to see what she tries next. Oh, don't worry, I said, watching Carol disappear inside. She's not done yet. And I was right. After getting caught in an illegal towing attempt, Carol went quiet for a couple of days. No passive-aggressive letters. No HOA board members snooping around my property. But I knew better than to think she'd given up. Sure enough, 3 days later, I got a new letter in the mail. Dear homeowner, effective immediately, HOA Regulation 14.6 has been updated. No resident may park any vehicle exceeding 6,000 pounds on neighborhood streets overnight. Violators will be subject to fines and towing. I laughed out loud. This was so obviously targeted at me, it was almost pathetic. My truck weighed about 6,500 pounds. And just like that, the HOA had pulled a brand new rule out of thin air just to try and stop me. Nice try, Carol. I wasn't about to roll over and accept this. If they were going to make up rules, I was going to find a way around them. First, I checked city parking laws. Turns out, while the HOA could make rules for driveways and private property, they did not have control over public streets. But they weren't totally powerless. If they filed enough complaints, the city could eventually be pressured to add new restrictions. I needed a countermove before they could do that, so I went to City Hall. After about 45 minutes of talking to a clerk, I found out something interesting. There were commercial vehicle parking permits available for contractors and business owners who needed to park overnight in residential areas. The only requirement? A valid business license registered to a home in the neighborhood. Guess what I already had? That's right. By the end of the day, I had a city-issued permit allowing me to park my truck exactly where I had been parking it. The next evening, I pulled into my usual spot in front of the HOA office. But this time, I taped a copy of my official permit inside the windshield, right where Carol would see it. Sure enough, the next morning, Carol stormed outside, saw the permit, and nearly screamed. I leaned against my truck, sipping my coffee. Morning, Carol. You look stressed. Her hands clenched into fists. This is not allowed. Oh, but it is. I tapped the permit. City issued. Perfectly legal. Nothing your little HOA can do about it. She was fuming. I could practically see the smoke coming out of her ears. Checkmate. Carol had lost again, and this time, she had no way out. But I wasn't done yet. If she thought this was bad, she had no idea what was coming next. Carol must have spent the entire morning foaming at the mouth over my permit because, by noon, she was back in full attack mode. This time, she wasn't alone. I was outside, checking over my truck, when I saw her marching down the sidewalk with two other HOA board members, Todd and Diane. Todd was your typical HOA lapdog, always nodding along with whatever Carol said. Diane, on the other hand, seemed like she'd rather be anywhere else. Carol, however, was fired up. She stomped right up to me, jabbing a finger at my windshield. You think this little permit changes anything? I took a slow sip of my coffee. Yeah, Carol, I do, she scoffed. The board is meeting today, and we're discussing a new motion to ban commercial vehicle permits in the neighborhood. I grinned. You mean the city issued permits that your HOA has zero authority over? Todd cleared his throat. Well, we can petition the city to revoke it. I laughed. On what grounds? Dear city officials, we hate the aesthetics of pickup trucks. Please change the law for our feelings. Carol's eye twitched. Diane, however, finally spoke up. Carol, maybe we should just let this go. Carol shot her a glare. We are protecting the integrity of this community. Diane sighed. It's a truck, Carol, not a meth lab. I nearly choked on my coffee. Carol turned red but ignored her. We'll see what the board decides. Now, I wasn't about to let Carol run her mouth to the HOA board uncontested. So, before their meeting that night, I did a little digging. I started by talking to a few neighbors. Turns out, a lot of people weren't happy with Carol's reign of terror. She had been handing out fines left and right for ridiculous things. A woman down the street got fined because her garden gnome wasn't in compliance with community decor. A retired vet got a warning because his American flag was too large. Another guy got a $200 fine because his trash cans weren't pulled in fast enough after pickup. The more I heard, the more I realized Carol wasn't just power hungry. She was out of control. That's when I found the real golden ticket. A neighbor, Mark, mentioned that Carol had been using HOA funds to pay for consulting fees to her friend's landscaping company. Translation? She was funneling HOA money to her buddy's business. Oh ho ho. Now this was useful. That evening, I showed up to the HOA meeting. Normally, I wouldn't bother, but tonight was going to be fun. The room was filled with homeowners, and at the front of the room, Carol sat with her usual smug expression, ready to push her anti-truck agenda. She called the meeting to order and immediately launched into her nonsense. As many of you are aware, we have had an ongoing issue with a resident disregarding community standards by parking a large commercial vehicle in a manner that disrupts the aesthetics of our neighborhood. I leaned back in my chair. You mean a legally parked truck with a city permit? Carol ignored me. Tonight, I am proposing that we formally petition the city to revoke all commercial vehicle permits for our neighborhood. A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. They knew this was just about me. That's when I stood up. Actually, before we get to that, I think we need to discuss something way more important. Carol narrowed her eyes. This is not your turn to speak. I smirked. I think the neighborhood might want to hear about how HOA funds have been mysteriously disappearing into consulting fees. Dead silence. Carol stiffened. Excuse me. I pulled out a stack of papers, printouts of the HOA's financial records that I had gotten from a friend on the board. Funny thing, Carol. Over the last 2 years, thousands of dollars in landscaping consulting fees have been paid to a company owned by your friend. Murmurs rippled through the room. Diane, the one board member who actually had a conscience, turned toward Carol. Is this true? Carol's face went white. Those were necessary expenses to maintain community standards. I flipped through the pages. Really? Because it looks like those necessary expenses were double what was paid to the previous landscaper. And funny enough, they only started when you became HOA president. Now the room was fully against her. Someone from the back shouted, "Are you using our HOA fees to pay off your friends?" Another neighbor added, "This is corruption." Carol looked like she was going to explode. I will not stand here and be accused. I grinned. Then sit down, Carol. Preferably somewhere far away from the HOA. What happened next was pure, poetic justice. Neighbors started demanding an audit of the HOA finances. Then someone made a motion to remove Carol as HOA president. Carol tried to argue, but at that point, even Todd, her loyal little lapdog, was avoiding eye contact. By the end of the night, the board had voted to suspend Carol pending an investigation. Her reign of terror? Over. And as I walked out of that meeting, I made sure to say, just loud enough for her to hear, "Guess I'll go park my truck now." With Carol suspended and an investigation into her shady HOA dealings underway, I thought I could finally kick back, park my truck where I pleased, and enjoy watching her spiral into irrelevance. But if there's one thing I've learned about power-hungry HOA tyrants, it's that they don't go down without a fight. A week after the meeting, I got another HOA violation notice in the mail. Dear Mr. Walker, despite ongoing community concerns regarding your commercial vehicle, the HOA board has determined that your truck remains a disturbance. As such, we are issuing a $500 fine for continued noncompliance. Failure to pay will result in legal action. I almost burst out laughing. Carol wasn't even in charge anymore, but she was still trying to come after me. Clearly, she had friends on the board who were willing to keep pushing her vendetta. But they made a huge mistake. They put this nonsense in writing. And lucky for me, I already had a lawyer on speed dial. I called up my buddy Jake, who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. "Let me get this straight," he said, after reading the letter. "They're fining you for something that is completely legal?" "Yup." "And they're ignoring the city-issued permit you have?" "Yup." He chuckled. "Oh, this is going to be fun." Jake immediately drafted up a legal response, outlining. First of all, the HOA had zero authority over public streets. Secondly, my permit was issued by the city, which overruled any HOA nonsense. Thirdly, any attempt to collect a fine for legal activity could be considered harassment and an abuse of power. We sent the letter directly to the HOA board, and for good measure, to the city council as well. A few days later, the neighborhood was buzzing. Apparently, after receiving my lawyer's letter, the HOA board realized they had screwed up big time. Not only were they in the wrong legally, but with Carol already under investigation for shady financial dealings, they knew they were on thin ice. And just when things couldn't get worse for them, they did. Because the city's finance department started looking into Carol's kickback scheme. Turns out, she wasn't just funneling HOA money to her landscaper friend. She had also been pocketing a cut of it. And that was fraud. Within a month, Carol was officially removed from the HOA board. The city launched an official fraud investigation against her. The HOA quietly dropped all fines against me. A new HOA president was elected, a guy named Mike, who immediately started repealing Carol's nonsense rules. And the best part? Carol had to sell her house and move out. Between the legal fees, the investigation, and the absolute destruction of her reputation, she decided to cut her losses and leave. On the day she moved out, I made sure to park my truck right in front of her driveway. I sat on my tailgate, sipping a beer, and watched as the moving truck pulled away, Carol fuming in the passenger seat. And just before they turned the corner, I gave her one last wave. She didn't wave back, but honestly, that made it even better. Final score: Carol, destroyed. HOA, put in its place. Me, still parking my truck wherever the hell I want. Thank you for being with us. Please share in the comments where you are from and whether you liked everything, and see you next time.